Welcome, everyone. Please go ahead and take a seat. We're going to get started because we have a packed conversation in a very short amount of time. My name is Andrea Collins with NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and so I want to welcome you to this deep dive session. It's called Insights from the Town Hall, working with local governments to drive food waste policy. We have a great panel lined up here for you. Here we go. Yesterday on the main stage, Dana challenged us to think bigger, and I would contend that the best way to do that is through changing policy. It's how we set a floor for our expectations of our collective behavior. It's how we incentivize our values, and it's how we drive systems change. So we're going to talk about all of that here today. Our lovely panelists are Tori Oto, a clinical fellow at the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, Joseph Rossell, a food systems program manager at the city of Phoenix, and Bijur, the materials management supervisor at Vermont DEC, and Danielle Todd, the executive director of Make Food Not Waste in Detroit. And we're going to do a little bit of a different format than you've probably seen at some of the other ones. Tori's going to give us a little bit of an update on a new resource that's available, and then we're going to jump in to each of these folks are going to tell us about their specific policies. So I'll hand it over to you.
Hello. Oh, that's loud. Okay, well, thank you.
Do you want this?
Yeah, I'll take
Okay.
the little clicker. So my name is Tori. I'm with the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. I'm here to talk about the new state food waste reduction. Did it cut out? Policy toolkit, which Dana mentioned briefly at her keynote. And so if you're not familiar with the setup of a law school clinic, partner organizations. Oh, what am I? Oh, switch. Here. Hello. And I knew you want to hear me. Okay. We work with partner organizations and communities, providing guidance on food system issues, while at the same time working with law students, teaching them about food law and policy. And I'm actually also here part of the Zero Food Waste Coalition. And this coalition is a partnership of these four organizations that you see, REFED, WWF, NRDC, and Harvard. And we're really trying to build some momentum and alignment on food law and policy. And what this toolkit is, it highlights some of the key policy opportunities and best practices for policymakers, advocates, to keep pushing the needle on food law and policy. And so even though these four organizations were the lead authors on the toolkit report, it was a joint effort. We worked with 24 experts across 16 different organizations to really make sure what the policies that we highlight in the toolkit are really reflecting model policy. And so before jumping into what the toolkit contains, I'll just briefly highlight why we're looking at states in the first place. States, based on our experience and what we've seen, is they're really leading the way, carving the way in advancing, progressing, innovating around food loss and waste policy. They have some of the broadest authority as compared to federal versus local governments to be doing that, and they have been. And just in 2022, there were 90 different bills that were introduced across the states, 20 of which were passed. And that's kind of a part of a bigger trend that we're seeing internationally too. So another project that we have with the Law School Clinic is the Atlas, Global Food Donation Policy Atlas, which has canvassed a number of 24 different countries around the same types of policies that they're working on. And we're seeing the same trend of more attention and focus around food law and policy, which is great to see. So here are all the toolkit policies, all the policies that are in the toolkit. There are 15 different policies across 6 different categories. And the kind of approach that we took is we wanted to make sure we're covering all the policies along the food recovery hierarchy. the highest and best used, food donation, there's an animal feed section, and then we go all the way down to compost procurement, building out end markets for compost. We also try and make sure we're covering all the generators across the food supply chain, and have a mix of, carrots versus sticks, regulation versus, positive incentives to try and get food businesses to change their business practices a little bit more voluntarily. So for each of those policies on the previous slide, this is kind of what is contained for each section. So we start with general background, who are the states who are already working this space? What does the model look like there? What are some of the lessons that we've learned? If there's any relevant federal law, what does that look like and how does that apply to the states? But then the meat of each of the sections for each of these policies is we break down what are the key components of model policy in the states. What should you be thinking about? What are the key decision points if you're an advocate or you're a policymaker? What are those key decision points where you could either, to try and be most progressive in reducing food loss and waste, how do you kind of do that? Let's see. And then in addition to that kind of policy breakdown, we actually then also went ahead and drafted model legislation that could be introduced at the state level, and it looks a little bit something like this. This is the first 2 pages of our organic waste bans model legislation. And what you see in red are we highlight what are those decision points that you should be thinking about and that you'll have to kind of fill in for your own state. But yes, that's the toolkit, and we have QR codes on the tables too, and a couple in-person copies if you're interested. But thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you for that overview of yourself and the resource and the coalition. Appreciate that very much. Danielle, Ann, and Joseph, will you each tell us about yourself, a policy from your region, and what success looks like for that policy?
Sure. Before, though, if you want to come up, there's some seats here and a couple over here, too. Come grab a seat. Yes, raise your hand if you're next to an empty seat so people can find a place to sit down. Great. I'm Danielle. I'm the executive director of Make Food Not Waste in Detroit, and we are a nonprofit. We are advocates for food loss and waste reduction with a special emphasis on prevention, source reduction, and recovery. We find in our state that, like many states, that food loss and waste is not necessarily seen as a key climate driver. And when it is, it's people typically think of composting. Maybe they think of recovery, but certainly not. They don't even realize all of the wonderful things that you can do higher up on the hierarchy. So that's what we feel is part of our job, is to help people realize that there are a lot more that they can do. Right now, we're working on behalf of the state of Michigan on creating a roadmap for how we can reduce food loss and waste in farming, manufacturing, food service, and grocery. And that roadmap recommendation, which will come out at the end of the summer, will have recommendations for policies and incentives, public-private partnerships, all the things that we heard about the past few days, and certainly incorporating this wonderful toolkit that has just launched yesterday. But I would say one of the policies that I'm particularly really excited to see in our recommendations that are coming out is related to food donation, and but specifically around health, food safety and health inspections. What we hear all the time from food donors is that they are just not confident in the legislation that protects them from liability. And we believe that just telling them that there is protection is clearly not. They're just not confident in it. And so to get beyond that, we feel that we really need to create some sort of food safety structure for them. That's how they operate their businesses already. It's very familiar to them. So to be able to say, from a policy perspective, here is clearly how you engage with food safety in your donation practices. You have a label. The label states that when the food was prepared, the packaging is not ripped or torn. It says what's in the packaging, and that the temperature was kept correctly, and all of that. So. And then making sure that information is clear and accessible to anyone who's interested in finding out that information. Right now, it's, you have to call all the health departments to find out if there's any regulation around it. So I expect, so when I think about what success looks like, I think we'll see more food donations. I think people really want to donate their food, but they really are concerned about that liability, and this should make a dent in that.
Thanks. Anne, tell us about yourself and your policy and what success looks like.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my name's Anne Bijur. I am the Materials Management Supervisor in Vermont's Department of Environmental Conservation, and I could give you even more categories within the government, but I won't do that. So my role is to help implement the state's materials management plan and also other solid waste related laws. We also have a single-use products law and many extended producer responsibility programs. So first, I'm just curious, I want to set the stage or set the context. Who has been to Vermont here? Ooh, nice. All right. Well, and if you haven't been to Vermont, I just want to let you know we're a very small state, population of about 650,000. We are bordered on the east by the Connecticut River, on the west by Lake Champlain and some other mountains, and then we have the Green Mountains that run north-south up and down the spine. I like to think that we are unique, but we're basically just like the average American. I'd like you to think about when you go to the grocery store and you buy a 5-pound bag of potatoes. So I want everybody to feel that bag of potatoes in your hand, okay? So that's about the average amount of waste that an American produces every day. I think it's a little bit less, 4.8 pounds. Well, in Vermont, I think we're so exceptional, but we actually produce a little bit more than that. So last year, I'm setting this context for the problem. So last year, we, per capita, it was about 5.5 pounds of waste. And out of that, about 2 pounds was diverted, so through composting or recycling, and the remainder was sent to the landfill. So we're a small state, and I'm just curious, how many landfills do you think we have? Active landfills. I'll give you a guess. You can count them on one hand. We have one. We have one active landfill in the northern part of the state. I forgot to say that we're bordered by Canada, so most of our waste has to be trekked all the way up to the northern part of the state. In the southern part, some goes to Massachusetts or New Hampshire or New York, but primarily we have one landfill. So all of this waste, we have a lot of pressure on that one landfill. So in 2012, the catalyst for the law I'm going to tell you about, which is called our Universal Recycling Law, or Act 148, was that a legislator, wanted to reduce the pressure on that landfill, and he also noticed that just like the national average, our diversion rate hovers around 34%. And no matter what we had done, we hadn't been able to get the diversion rate above that number. So, he proposed this law, and it passed unanimously, which is a great fact, I think. And it had two goals, it has two goals. The two primary goals are to reduce that overall 5.5 pound bag of trash, and to also reduce the toxicity of our waste, but then to increase our recycling and diversion of organic materials. So two primary goals. And so what the law does, there are lots of components. I'm not going to go into all of them, but the two I feel like relate most to food are we wanted to make it convenient and consistent for Vermonters to manage their waste across the state. So one of the things, one of the parts of the law to do that is that every transfer station across the state, which most Vermonters have one within their community, maybe within 10 miles, must accept food scraps. And that part of the law, that wasn't right when the law was passed, but that kind of was phased in later on. So that's kind of a way that we try to make it convenient and consistent and increase access across the state for all Vermonters. And then the part of the law you've probably heard the most about is our landfill ban. We're the only state to have a complete landfill ban on organic materials. So everybody, down to, the largest grocery stores, the hospitals, the universities, the K-12 schools, me and my family, everybody, all my neighbors. What else did I want to tell you about this? So what is the state doing, or how have we helped encourage Vermonters to either know about this law or divert their food scraps? So we started with general awareness building, just mailing mailers, and lots of workshops, presentations at conferences, libraries, you name it, wherever anybody wanted or would welcome us in to talk, we would come talk with them. We've had 3 different media campaigns, and one of the resources that was talked about earlier in the conference is, I think the EPA is putting together, and 2 out of our 3 media campaigns will be available for anyone to use. You can pop in your own logo. And so we did 3 different ones. 2 were focused mostly on like awareness building. What is this law? What do we have to do? And then like how to separate your food scraps or how to compost if that's what you're going to do with them. And then the 3rd campaign focused on contamination reduction, which has been a big problem and continues to be a big problem. Let's see, we collaborate. So our state is divided up into lots of different solid waste management districts, and so we're not doing all the outreach. We work with them. They're required to go into businesses, to schools, and give community presentations about food scrap diversion, but also food waste reduction and again, how to compost. What else? We sponsor a master composter program. We work with UVM Extension, and it's kind of modeled on the Master Gardener program, if any of your other states have that as well. And then money. You need funding to do some of these things. So we have given grants to our solid waste management districts to do what they think is appropriate in their areas. We've also given larger grants, so up to, I think it's $1.5 million to different composting and recycling facilities to upgrade their facilities so that they can take more food scraps. And then we offer compost technical assistance through a consultant. We've done that to 45 facilities. We also have just a one-day, really affordable, I think it's $50 compost operator training, open to anybody. And then, let's see, do I still have more time? Okay. So I had to write everything up because I knew I would talk too long on this particular question.
Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome.
Joseph, will you tell us about yourself, your policy, and what success looks like?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Rossell. I'm the Food Systems Program Manager at the City of Phoenix. I'm in the Office of Environmental Programs. That's housed inside of our City Manager's office, and I work alongside 4 other individuals primarily devoted to food systems work, which is exciting because a few years ago there was only 1 person. For us, we've been really immersed in our Phoenix Resilient Food System Initiative. We got some funds from ARPA and the federal government to implement a $14 million initiative that spans 14 different programs. So very busy with that. And I wish I could be up here and say we have a state or a regional policy. I'm gonna take your toolkit. Amanda, we gotta take it back to our state. But we have a challenging environment, like most states, particularly with our state legislature. And it's just kind of a funny anecdote. In fact, I think this is true, but I think it's more myth now. But we've had a small municipality that attempted to ban single-use plastic bags years ago, and our former governor sued them or threatened to sue them because of their ban potentially violating his ban on bans. So this is the environment that we work in. And so for us, we don't have the ability to have an overarching policy that mandates food waste reduction. Maybe someday we will with some changes. But for us, we had to take these creative, voluntary, programmatic approaches. And for us, we knew that if we wanted to make progress on the problem of food waste, we would have to get cover for that. We'd have to get support from at least half of our council to say, hey, yes, go ahead and do that. So that, for us, was the development and implementation of our 2025 Food Action Plan. So it has 5 goals. If you want to know more about it, I'm happy to chat. But I think the goal that's most relevant for this group, since we're all focused on food waste solutions, is the goal to maintain a sustainable environment. And that encompasses all of our efforts to fight food waste. And so what I'll do is just chat about 2 things, 2 big programs that get at it. I promise I'll get there. But 2 big programs that we're working on and linking. The first one is, because we're not just focused on food waste, we have a comprehensive program about improving the food system. But the first big program I'd like to talk about is our backyard garden program, which Ariel LeBaron is our project manager. She's doing a great job. It's probably our most demanding program that we have. And that one is designed to empower residents to grow their own food in their backyards. And so they get to choose one of 3 systems: traditional raised bed, they could choose aquaponics, chance to harvest some fish protein, or something that's more automated composting and garden system. So they have that choice. But in addition to them just learning to grow their own food, we have this other program, which is what I'm excited about, and it's our food waste composting education and training program. And that's something that we're partnering with Arizona State University on. They have a College of Health Solutions that's really focused on reducing food waste at the household level. They've done some work around behavioral change. So we're working with them. And so what we're doing is we're linking these 2 programs to where residents, predominantly residents who live in food deserts, predominantly residents who come from Black and brown communities, are learning how to grow their own food. They could potentially sell it, but then at the same time, they're getting training not just on how to grow food, but how to tackle food waste in their household. So the food waste program that we have that we're going to implement is a 5-week training program. ASU is going to equip them with some multimedia educational content to discuss or understand the problem of food waste, implement different strategies to reduce it at the household level, and then also we're going to provide composting service to them for a year. So they get this great training on producing their food and then reducing their food. So it's like a circular economy of food at the household level. And we have about 400 residents who will go through that. Success for us, since I bet we're close to time here, success for us would be, for the food waste and composting program, would be to recruit 200 residents or as many residents as we can from the backyard garden program, so they can get the training, so they can maximize all the programs that are offered at the city and they utilize them. And then it would be for us to work with as many Black and brown communities as possible, because these folks don't get to go to these conferences like this. They don't get to go to study sustainability at the universities like some of us have had an opportunity to do. So we want them to get the same training and have that impact. So that's, I think, success for us. One thing that I will mention is that ASU, they've scoured the research literature, and they found that historically, Black and brown communities, this is not a surprise, were left out of food waste studies. They didn't get to go through these programs. It's focused primarily on non-Hispanic white populations. So success for us will be to engage those communities and get them as much training as they can to start making a difference.
Perfect timing. Thank you. My next question for Ann, Joseph, and Danielle is, how are you measuring success of your how are you measuring? So Ann, do you want to start off? We'll start in the middle.
So some of the successes, apart from data, which I can talk about later, one of the biggest ones was when the law was phased in from 2012 to 2020, and within the first 4 years, it was only the larger generators of food scraps that had to separate their food scraps from the trash, but it meant that they were looking at their donation levels, and it really made them see what they could be donating. And so within the first 3 years of the law, the Vermont Food Bank reported a tripling in the amount of food that was donated. So that was really exciting for us. I think a nice positive impact that we didn't really anticipate would be that large. And then some of the other successes just with, in terms of food scrap haulers, we didn't have that many in the beginning. It wasn't required, so it wasn't something that they could make money on. So in the beginning, we probably had 10 food scrap haulers, and right now I think we have like 35 or 40. And one of the really interesting things about that is a lot of the new businesses coming in are small entrepreneurs. It's a single man, a single mom, they have a truck, or they have a station wagon even, and they can buy some 5-gallon buckets and set up a business. So that was really great too. And then just in terms of amounts of food scraps collected, we have seen an increase in all the transfer stations around the state. And again, contamination has been an issue, but overall it's still working, and we're working with them to make it a more kind of pleasant process for residents. Actually, I won't go into those details, but we have seen an increase in certified compost facilities. We started with about 10 before the law, and now we have 19. And also community compost sites around the state have been growing, which is another way that we're improving access. And then in terms of data, every year we do what we call our D&D report, disposal and diversion. And so we collect data from all the certified facilities around the state. And so in terms of food scraps, the data we have are from those facilities. And then I talked about the donation data from Vermont Food Bank. What's not measured, and so what would show a larger increase than we've been able to actually show in our data is on-farm composting. We don't require reporting for that. Other on-site composting, so schools and community centers. And then we don't get data for animal feed and also for some of the anaerobic digestion. So we have showed that since the law went into effect, the amount of organics that we're collecting has increased every year. It did take a dip during COVID, but last year, the data, we don't have data for 2022 yet, but 2021 rebounded back to 2019 levels. So we are starting to hopefully continue to increase the amount of food scraps collected. Okay.
Joseph, do you want to tell us about how you're measuring success? 2 minutes.
Okay, so 2 programs. The first one, we actually have a data collection person on our team. Karen Ibarra is sitting there, and she will be collecting some data for our backyard garden program. So she's going to be looking at pounds of food grown, amount of water used to grow that food, and number of household members engaging in that system. Okay, so that's important because the way we define success for that will be 2 parts. This is a pilot. We're only in our 2nd year, and we're going to work with about 200 households. So we don't know what's best. We don't know how much they're going to get to grow and things like that. So success would be us understanding that. So when we begin to recruit for the 3rd year and the 4th year and into the foreseeable future, we're going to be able to tell residents, like, look, you can grow potentially X amount of pounds of food in your backyard. This is how much water will be required, so you could adjust your utility bill and your budget. And then also, more importantly, success would be to say, we've quantified the potential savings of you no longer having to go to the store, but growing it in your backyard. And then beyond that, the potential for income generation to where they grow their own food and they could sell it at a community exchange table at a farmer's market, and they could have that to go back into their family. So the other thing would be for our food waste and composting training program. Success for us, I mentioned it earlier, historically Black and brown communities have been ignored in this research. For us, getting them to participate in this program for its entirety is key. And then the other thing is ASU will be conducting a baseline level of food waste generation in the households just to get a feel for where they're at. So all the households, we have a budget for about 400 households to go through this. Once they go through that baseline, they're gonna get that 5-week training, that intervention. So success for us will drastically reduce the amount of food waste at the household level through those prevention measures, and then also, of course, composting.
Thanks. Danielle, will you tell us how you're measuring success?
We are much earlier in our process. So as I mentioned, we're creating a roadmap for the state, and in it will be the recommendations for how we will measure how successful we will be. But to date, there is very limited data. We're essentially using ReFED's numbers to estimate what's going on within the state. We are a big agricultural state, and that's a real opportunity there to involve farmers in measurement. But I would say in the specific policy that I mentioned around the food safety regulations for donations, we will be looking at that increase in donations, but also the quality of those donations. So what we want to make sure in encouraging people to donate is that it's not just kind of dumping your donated food onto people, which then makes the problem worse because it travels around before it ultimately gets thrown away. So not only measuring how much we're seeing that increase in donations, but is that actually getting to a recipient, and is that of a quality that's being consumed?
Great. So I have a question for all of you before we turn to the group. So if you're thinking about a question, get ready for that. You'll be next. The last question I have for each of you is, how are you incorporating racial equity or stakeholder and community perspectives in your project? Joseph, do you want to get started?
Okay, so thank you. For us, equity is that unifying thread for all of our programs. It's key. And there are a few ways that we've gone about incorporating that as much as we can. To go back to that overarching framework for the Food Action Plan, my supervisor, she was actually supposed to be here. I'm her backup. That's why I'm up here. Gross approximation, but I'll do my best. So she would tell you if she were up here that before the Food Action Plan was adopted in 2020, she put together a community of practice. And that was a major community engagement effort to incorporate the voices in historically redlined and marginalized communities. And a lot of times they're living in food deserts. So she brought in these voices who were most impacted by hunger and food insecurity to allow them to give their perspective on how we shape our food action plan. So that set the stage for it. And more importantly, they even had a chance to create a more localized food action plan for their community. It's in South Phoenix. So they have their local food action plan for South Phoenix. So that's what we did to begin with. With the Backyard Garden program, for us, we had a budget to fund about 200 to 300 households in the city of Phoenix. And when you think about how in the heck am I gonna prioritize 300 households in a city that's 1.7 million and growing? That was tough. So for us, we looked at a couple key criteria. We looked at those living in food deserts. We looked at, income. The lower the income, the higher we would score you because you would benefit most from growing this food in your backyard. And then we looked at households. So households that had a higher number of individuals living there, we would prioritize it. We wanted more folks engaging around the garden system. And then, of course, we prioritized members from the BIPOC community for that one. With the food waste and composting study, I mentioned it earlier today that because BIPOC community has been ignored, we're going to be prioritizing those folks. And then the last thing I said, I wish I had more time, we could talk about this, but under our ARPA Resilient Food System Initiative, equity is a key piece to everything. And so one program that I would mention, we have a worker cooperative sustainable food business training program. We still need a better name for that, but we'll work on that when I get back to Phoenix. But the idea behind that is that for 10 weeks, residents will be trained on worker cooperative principles and establishing their own worker cooperative. And it could be any step in the food system or multiple steps tackling those issues. So for that, recruitment for us is going to be more than 60% from the BIPOC community. What's great about that program is that we've already seen some folks from our Backyard Garden program take advantage of that and go through that training. So, in every single program that we do, it's a key piece.
Thank you. Danielle, do you want to answer the question about how you're incorporating racial equity or communities' perspectives?
Sure. So as part of the roadmap exercise, we're doing a deep stakeholder engagement across the different sectors in the food system. So farming, manufacturing, grocery, and retail. Food service. And what's really important about that, of course, is because we're hearing directly from people about the barriers that they're experiencing. And once we get past the point where they actually admit that they're wasting food, which does take a little bit because that's the first thing they'll tell you is, well, we don't waste. So, what's been interesting in this process is making sure we include the rural communities. They tend to get overlooked in a lot of the conversations as well. So making sure that we're including rural people from the food system across those areas as well, and making sure their voices are heard. It tends to they feel left out of the conversation, and we're making sure that we're reaching them in these interviews and this background research before we present our findings to the state.
And how are you including community perspectives?
Well, when I talked about the universal recycling law, it was designed to try to increase convenience and consistency across the state. So that, in a way, was to try to make it equitable for everyone to have access to manage their waste. We know that that isn't working for everybody, so we've been trying different things like encouraging more community compost sites so people have sites closer to where they live where they can bring their food scraps, or some restaurants can be drop-off sites. If they're getting their food scraps picked up, they can set up systems where neighbors can bring their food scraps as well. Again, we've been encouraging more food scrap haulers to cover more parts of the state. And then we've been doing things like reaching out to, I just forgot the name, Eat Well Vermont? No. Meals on Wheels. Where did that come from? The senior program, Meals on Wheels. You know, I thought, hey, they're going to these senior houses and delivering meals. Why couldn't the volunteers maybe bring their food scraps back and deliver them to a drop-off site? That did not go over well. So I'm still working on that and looking for other innovative ways that we can try to reduce the cost for people. Some, I didn't say before, but some transfer stations, it's free to drop your food scraps off, but some do charge, and that's not anything that we dictate in the law. That's up to the site. And then just overall, as a state, Vermont is really trying to look at diversity and equity and inclusion. The state of Vermont has a cabinet level now Office of Racial Equity, and there's staff that work with the director, and then the Agency of Natural Resources, of which the department is, or my department is part of. We also have a new director of, what is her title? Environmental Justice and Civil Rights. And she now has 2 staff, so they're going to start working with all of our staff to see how we can integrate more DEI principles into our work. We also contracted with a consultant to identify 3 environmental justice communities within the state and do a community engagement pilot to identify ways that we can get information about all the many programs that the department provides to different parts of our population. So yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. We also have had some staff racial and social equity trainings, and those are continuing on. So it's something that we're really encouraging staff to lean into and to help better meet the needs of all Vermonters.
Thanks. Tori, how have you included community perspectives?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I'll keep my answer brief. And I think there was something that Vanessa said yesterday at our closing remarks that really stuck with me, which is that a single story by itself is dangerous. And I think that really applies to the work that we're doing when we're trying to, identify what are the common barriers to advancing food loss and waste policy in a state or a jurisdiction, and take those barriers and come up with some sort of model policy around it. Like, you have to hear from a very diverse and broad set of stakeholders, not just like the loudest voices, but who are the organizations that are already on the ground, doing this hard work, and you have to think, like, what we try to do is try and think through these policies of, like, when we introduce it, who are all the actors that are going to be affected by it, and how can we, try and encourage the state to support those actors in ways that maybe they're not right now. And one example there was with our food donation requirement policy section. We wanted, we've kind of heard throughout this conference that there's this lack of data going on. So it was really important to us to include a requirement, a component of that food donation requirement to say that there needs to be some reporting around how much food is being recovered and donated by food businesses. And it was tricky because we didn't want it to fall on food businesses to do that, because you can see some of the biases that would be introduced there. But that means then it's going to be falling on food recovery organizations, and you have to think about not just the big orgs who already have the resources to be doing that type of reporting, but the smaller organizations as well. And so, if we had to fall in the line of saying, food recovery organizations are going to be doing the reporting, then we also have to be telling the state, you need to be providing them funding to develop that technology and for overhead costs, et cetera. So that's kind of how we have approached it.
Sorry for this. So we are recording, and if folks who are watching the live cast have questions, we have a way of incorporating those too. And because of that, we're going to hope that we can pass the mic so that everyone can hear the questions that are generated here. And I've been instructed to tell you to continue the discussion in the app discussion board. There's a lot of opportunity for us to discuss amongst ourselves, not just with the panelists. So we have time to take questions from the group, and we're going to have to do like a Mike Trado thing here. Go ahead.
I saw this hand first over here. Thank you. My name is Cheryl. I'm from Connecticut. Hi, Tori. Hello, Anne. My question is actually to you, Tori. I know that Boston, Massachusetts passed a local ordinance about food donation. I know the city of New Haven in Connecticut is looking at the same. I'm curious, what is this in terms of a trend of bypassing the state and going further, and sort of what are the lessons learned about this approach? Thank you.
So the ordinance in Boston, I think, has just been introduced so far to do something really similar to what California is doing around SB 1383, saying the largest food businesses are going to need to start requiring, donating their food. And I think, like you mentioned, New Haven, it's like thinking about maybe introducing something similar. But yeah, I think it's tricky when you're having a bunch of different smaller counties or cities introducing legislation that, ideally it would be the state doing it and using all their resources to have it be a broader approach. But at the end of the day, if the state is not going to be taking the reins and kind of pushing policy that the way that you want, it's great to see that cities are kind of pushing that forward a little bit. And we see a really similar trend state to federal, where the states, are often innovators that then the federal government will take up. And we saw that with the Food Donation Improvement Act that passed. It was the states who kind of piloted it in the first instance. So I think there is a growing trend around specifically food donation requirements, because I know SB 1383 was California's the first to do it, but New York also has a donation component. Washington has a donation component that they're I don't think they've actually issued the regulations of how they're going to be doing it, but I think there is a trend in saying, food businesses, you need to really start thinking about how you're valuing food and incorporate it into your business model, and no longer just going with the flow and going with status quo and throwing out food. But yeah, I think that's a growing trend for sure.
I want to ask a question from one of our virtual attendees, Celine Allen Castro. What are the regulations limiting the possibilities to feed animals with food loss and waste? And then also, if anyone's willing to share in the app afterwards, any links to know more about these options.
To take a first stab on that one. This has been actually a new project for us that we're kind of looking at. And unfortunately, it kind of happened before we were able to really dive into it for the toolkit. And we do have a section in the toolkit that's around animal feed. And part of what's in there now is that there are some really outdated laws around feeding food scraps to animals. I think there was this fear back in the day around food safety concerns that came up. But then, the federal government has come in and they passed a number of different regulations or laws that regulate how you have to treat food before you're able to feed it to animals. And what we've seen and what the research has shown is that that regulation that exists on the federal level is already enough to make the animal feed that's ultimately produced safe. But there's still some of these like leftover state laws that say it's not allowed, like you can't do it anyway. So I think number one is getting rid of those laws. And something else that we're starting to see is these innovative models that are coming in and trying to take food scraps and turn it into animal feed in new and different ways, is that there's some confusing and like duplicative regulations in how we regulate solid waste facilities, how we regulate animal feed facilities. So I think what we need to see there going forward is like the state, again, like doing what I've said they've been doing, is like be innovative, push the needle, and like don't be afraid to use your authority that you already have in like kind of new, unique ways to really support animal feed models that are, you know, kind of seeing a resurgence.
I think this is another example where stakeholder engagement is really important. What we find when we talk to farmers is that they really just don't want this stuff. And so it's really easy for people to say, oh, well, you know, we'll send it to the farms, and the farmers are shaking their head and saying, we are very careful about what we feed our animals, and they're on a diet, and you can't just come and give us your food scraps. So I think making sure that we're engaging the farming community in any of those conversations is going to be really important.
Hi, my name is Krista Long. I'm with SCS Engineers. I have a question for Anne. So when the universal recycling law was passed, did you have capacity already in the state to manage all your organics, or did that infrastructure have to be built?
No, we did not have adequate capacity. The reason why the landfill ban on organics was phased in over a 6-year period was to allow for that capacity to develop. And then the $1.5 million in grants that we gave out was also to different facilities to either expand what they're doing or just to get started. Yeah, and then, you know, we haven't given money to community compost sites, but that's something we also actively encourage.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hurd from the Chicago Department of Public Health. And Tori, I wanted to ask if we can take your model legislation and tweak it for city home rule units of government?
Yeah, I'm sure it depends on the actual regulation and like how appropriate it would be to like adapt it. But like I think we'd be happy to work with you on like how to do that. And actually, some of our regulations, and of course I'm blanking on which one it is, but we actually used ELI's model that was meant to be for cities and adapted it to be at the state level. So there's also a number of resources that we've like pointed to in our toolkit that I think kind of are already doing what we're hoping to get at. Yeah.
Hi, Eliza Krasinski, King County Solid Waste. Anne, you talked about some difficulties with trying to implement a Meals on Wheel program or working with them. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that learning opportunity and to the speakers in general, you know, when you're trying to get more engagement for a system that's currently in place or build momentum for something that you would like to be in place, what those lessons learned have been when trying to speak to a specific audience.
I wish I had more of a story to tell with the Meals on Wheels. It was just an idea I had one day. I had actually signed up to be a volunteer myself and thought, you know, it's kind of like backhauling. Why don't we just get the transportation system going? But maybe because of food safety issues, or I'm not exactly sure, the person who I talked to was not interested in continuing the conversation. But it's good that this is coming up again, because I, to be honest, I can't remember whether that was before COVID or, you know, after. And I think it's probably a conversation I should try again. And, you know, to those of you out there, if you have any other innovative ideas for me, I would love to hear them. In terms of trying to build momentum or motivation, one of the things that we have done is we have a scrapfoodwaste.org website, and on that website is a page called Scrapbook, And we took the idea of social norming and identified different individuals across the state that were managing their food scraps in all different ways, and asked if they would kind of tell us their story and with photographs. And so you can look on there and learn. We've done it with lots of individuals, and we started to do it with businesses, but actually I'm realizing I think we kind of fell off with that. But it's just a good way. It's like the bright spots out there. Like you can do this. There's other Vermonters just like you who are doing it too, and that can help encourage people to try something new.
Quick. For us, with the audiences that we want to work with and the communities we want to work with, I think building that community of practice to get buy-in into the food action plan was key for us. And I think where we go in the future is developing one of those around food waste solutions in the community to find out what's already going on. It doesn't have to be this fancy, expensive research study with ASU. There might be a really powerful solution going on within the community that we don't know about, but they could be adopted for the rest of the community.
I just want to add one more thing. When I was doing business outreach in the southern part of the state, I went to a McDonald's, and they had been separating their food scraps for years, like before the ban, and it was just amazing to me and great, because then I could have that. I asked the manager, can I give your name to other fast food restaurants around the state? And so to have those kind of resources, I think, is really helpful.
Hi, my name is Molly. I'm with St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I've seen, coming from northern Minnesota and going to the cities, seeing plastic bag bans and plastic straw bans in Minneapolis. And back home, we don't even really have recycling. Like if anybody wants to recycle, you have to drive it yourself, you have to pay for it. Businesses don't recycle because there's no commercial recycling. So I guess when we're talking about creating state level policy, how are we taking into, account what infrastructure is already there and making sure that rural communities have the manpower and the funding to actually do that when there's already existing inequities?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm happy to take a first stab there. I think this also kind of connects to what the states are doing also is one piece of a bigger picture, and one way that we see the federal government coming in and acting in this space is to provide some of that funding to build up infrastructure, because especially when it comes to building something like a composting or an AD facility, there are crazy high upfront costs associated with that, and if it's even the state government can't necessarily always be paying for that, especially not a small county or an underfunded city. So that kind of relates to how the different levels of government need to be kind of working together to advance in this space. So if a state wants to pass an organic waste ban, there's funding available, and hopefully there will be more funding available after the Farm Bill to kind of build up the infrastructure.
One thing I'll add, which is probably not anything I would ever lead with, but Vermont is a very rural state, and the Northeast Kingdom part of our state did apply for an exemption for recycling pickup. The haulers did not want to have to pick up recycling. And so that was granted, and that is part of our law. So sometimes, to get something passed, you have to make compromises. That said, there are transfer stations all over that area that do accept recycling.
I think that's a really important point to bring up. We hear that in our stakeholder interviews all the time for rural communities that say just that. You just don't have the density to have the food rescue or other just type of infrastructure that you have in the cities. Lost me a second there. And And so in those communities in particular, I feel like source reduction is even more important because you don't have the sort of downstream type solutions. And it's also a matter of meeting people where they are, which again, we're harping on the stakeholder interviews, but to not just apply a blanket policy that applies to the whole state without recognizing that there is a really big range of infrastructure that exists, and so really understanding from the different types of communities what's available, what the interest level is, and bringing the policy along slowly and with people to try to be creative and not just make a one size fits all.
Hello, sorry. Sorry if you covered this already. I apologize. But are there any financial penalties for those who have a ban for food waste, and are there any financial incentives for those of you who are voluntary for that? And then secondly, if there's time, how do you deal with cross-contamination?
I can speak to the first question about the penalties. I think part of our process too, when we've been interviewing all the different stakeholders around the organic waste ban piece, some of that was like hearing from the governments who already have one in place and like, what were your barriers, what worked well for you, what would you recommend to another state? And what we heard over and over was like making sure that you have an enforcement scheme. So saying, if you business are violating this, you're gonna have to pay a fine every day. But like, I will, kind of add to that too, is saying that was helpful for them to be able to have that stick in the background, so that when they're offering the carrot, saying, here's how we're helping you, here's all the education we're providing, here's how you can do it. You have to balance the penalty, right, with like the education. I think that's what we've seen be successful in the past.
We do have fines, but as of today, we have not actually given any yet. We really have tried to emphasize outreach and education. I'm not in the compliance section of my program. We do have 3 people on that staff, and I think COVID really put a wrench into everything because the landfill ban was complete on July 1st, 2020. So, we just took a step back for a while, and now are just starting to get back out into doing outreach and education. And so I can tell you that we will probably see some fines, in the near future, because, you just need to do that sometimes to make people move.
Given that we are way far from the main stage, I think I'm going to call the conversation there. It's been a really robust hour. I hope you all have learned something that you can take home and are inspired to make policy change in your own level at whatever that can be. The next event is on the main stage. It's called The Future is Now, The Power of Youth to Spark Action. And I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion there. So thank you all very much for joining this conversation, and thank you to our panelists.